The wind came first, a long, low moan that carried across the empty prairie like a warning. Clouds rolled in behind it, heavy and dark, blotting out the late afternoon sun. Inside a small sod house on the edge of the Texas frontier, a woman named Martha tightened the shutters and listened. She knew the signs of a winter storm, but this one felt different. The temperature had dropped in a heartbeat. The air itself seemed sharp enough to cut. She pushed another log into the iron stove and watched the flames leap higher, sending shadows across the packed earth floor. Outside, the world turned gray and then nearly black as the first flakes of snow began to fall. By nightfall, the blizzard roared like a living thing. Snow struck the windows in hard bursts, rattling the boards and sealing the door in a thick crust of ice. The little house trembled under each blast of wind. Martha checked the latch again and pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She lived miles from the nearest settlement. Her husband was away with a supply wagon and would not return for several days. Only the steady crackle of the stove kept the darkness from swallowing the room. She tried to read by the flicker of lamplight, but the storm's howl made it impossible to focus. It sounded almost like voices calling through the night. Sometime after midnight, she heard a different sound. At first she thought it was another trick of the wind, a faint wail rising and falling between the gusts. But when she held her breath and listened carefully, the cry came again. It was high and thin, too steady to be the creak of a branch or the groan of timber. Martha set down her book and moved toward the door, heart pounding. She pressed her ear against the wood. There it was again, a soft keening that cut through the storm. It sounded like a child. Fear and disbelief fought inside her chest. No one could be outside in such weather. The nearest neighbor lived more than a mile away, and even a strong man would struggle to survive a few minutes in the open. Yet the cry persisted, weak but insistent, carried on the wind like a plea. Martha grabbed her lantern and wrapped herself in her thickest coat. She knew the risk. The storm could blind her within seconds, erase the path back to the house, bury her in drifting snow. But the sound of that tiny voice left her no choice. She pulled the door open against the force of the gale and stepped into the swirling night. The cold struck like a fist, stealing her breath and numbing her fingers through the heavy gloves. Snowflakes whipped around her lantern, blurring the light into a shifting halo. She followed the sound, her boots sinking deep with each step. The wind tore at her coat and filled her ears with a roar that made it hard to tell where the cry was coming from. She paused, turned her head, and heard it again, slightly to the east, near the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. Gritting her teeth, she pushed forward, one hand shielding the lantern, the other gripping the fence rail to keep her balance. Minutes stretched like hours. Her feet slipped on hidden ice, and snow packed into the tops of her boots. Still the cry guided her through the darkness, closer and closer until at last the lantern's glow caught a small shape against the white ground. Martha gasped. There, half buried in a drift, lay a tiny bundle of fur and cloth. The wailing came from inside. She dropped to her knees, brushing snow away with trembling hands. Beneath the wet coverings was a baby, a small boy with dark hair plastered to his forehead, his skin pale from the cold. His eyes fluttered weakly as he cried. Martha scooped him into her arms, pressing his icy body against her chest. The child's clothes were soaked and stiff. He was wrapped in a deerskin blanket marked with colored beads, a pattern she recognized from the nearby Comanche camp. Panic flickered through her mind. If the tribe had lost this baby, they might already be searching. If they found her with him, what would they believe? But the thought lasted only a heartbeat. The infant's breaths were shallow and fast. Without warmth, he would not survive another hour. She turned back toward the house, shielding the baby from the wind with her own body. The return journey felt twice as long. Snow blinded her eyes and stung her cheeks until they burned. The lantern flickered and nearly went out, but she kept moving, guided by the faint outline of the fence posts. Her muscles ached from the effort of holding the child tight against her chest. At last the dark shape of the sod house loomed through the storm like a promise. She stumbled onto the porch, kicked the door open with her boot, and hurried inside. The warmth of the stove wrapped around them like a blanket. Martha shut the door and dropped the latch, then knelt by the fire, peeling away layers of frozen cloth. The baby whimpered but no longer cried. She rubbed his tiny hands between her palms, pressed her warm breath against his face, and wrapped him in dry blankets from her bed. Slowly, color returned to his cheeks. His eyes opened just enough to meet hers, dark and wide beneath delicate lashes. Relief flooded through her, followed by a new wave of questions. Where had he come from? Why was he alone in the storm? And what would happen when his people discovered who had saved him? Outside, the blizzard raged on, a wall of white hiding the prairie and the distant Comanche camp. Inside the small house, the child slept in the circle of her arms, his breath shallow but steady. Martha rocked him gently, her own heart still racing from the rescue. Whatever danger lay beyond her door, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This baby had survived the storm because she could not turn away from a cry in the night. Morning came pale and cold, the storm still hammering against the sod walls of the little house. Martha had barely slept. Each time the baby stirred or whimpered, she sat upright, afraid that the faint breath she felt against her neck might suddenly stop. The fire in the stove had burned low during the night. She fed it with the last of the dry wood, watching sparks rise and flare as the cabin warmed again. The child lay wrapped in a thick quilt, his tiny chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. Frost traced delicate patterns across the inside of the window glass. Beyond that thin barrier, the prairie was a featureless white. Wind howled across the plains like a living creature, carrying the bitter scent of frozen earth. She studied the baby in the gray light. His skin was warmer now, no longer the frightening shade of blue she had first seen beneath the snow. A faint flush colored his cheeks. Dark lashes rested against soft skin. His tiny fists opened and closed as he dreamed. Martha touched the beads sewn into the edge of the deerskin blanket that had come with him. The colors, deep red, bright turquoise, and black, formed a pattern she recognized from years of living on this land. It belonged to the Comanche. There was no doubt about it. This child was not lost by accident. Somewhere out there, a family waited or grieved or searched. Questions spun through her mind. How had he ended up alone in the middle of a blizzard? Had his parents been caught in the storm? Were they already dead, buried under drifts of snow somewhere between here and the distant camp? Or were warriors even now searching the frozen prairie, following faint tracks that the wind was quickly erasing? Each possibility tightened the knot of worry in her chest. The Comanche were proud and fierce. If they believed she had taken one of their children, would they listen to her explanation? Or would they see only an enemy holding what belonged to them? The baby stirred and let out a small cry, snapping her from her thoughts. She lifted him gently, cradling the fragile weight against her shoulder. His warmth seeped through the quilt and into her skin. He smelled of smoke and leather of the wild prairie itself. She hummed an old hymn, the tune shaky but soft. The sound seemed to calm him. His small body relaxed and his breathing deepened. As she rocked, Martha's mind returned to the night before. She pictured herself stepping into the storm, the lantern light bouncing wildly in the gale, the cry that had led her across the icy ground. She had acted on instinct, not logic. Any neighbor would have called it reckless, even dangerous. But if she had hesitated, even for a minute, the baby would have frozen before morning. The hours dragged as the blizzard raged on. Light shifted from dim gray to a dull, muted white as the day wore forward. Martha kept busy to push away fear. She boiled water, soaked strips of cloth to wipe the baby's face and hands, and fed him drops of warm milk from a spoon. Each small task steadied her nerves. Yet every gust of wind against the door made her heart jump. She imagined figures emerging from the snow, tall riders wrapped in furs, dark eyes flashing with anger. She pictured 100 warriors surrounding her tiny home, demanding to know why a white woman held a Comanche child. She tried to remind herself that she had done nothing wrong. She had saved a life. But in a land where misunderstandings often ended in violence, Good intentions could be lost beneath suspicion. Toward midday, the storm reached its fiercest point. Snow hissed against the windows, and the roof groaned under the weight of ice. Martha checked the latch on the door again and again, fearing it might give way. The baby woke and began to fuss, his small cries swallowed by the wind. She held him close and whispered soothing words, though she doubted he could understand. His dark eyes opened briefly, unfocused but searching. The trust in that tiny gaze filled her with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. She would face any danger rather than let harm come to him. When the baby finally fell asleep again, Martha sat by the stove and stared into the flames. Memories of her own childhood surfaced: long winters in Missouri, her mother singing by lamplight, the gentle weight of her younger brother when he was a baby. That brother had died of fever before his first birthday, a loss that had carved a quiet hollow in her heart. Perhaps that memory had driven her into the storm the night before. Perhaps some deep part of her refused to let another child slip away if there was even a chance to save him. By late afternoon, the wind began to shift. The steady roar softened to a restless murmur. Through a gap in the shutters, faint light filtered in, revealing a world buried beneath drifts as high as the fence posts. The storm had eased but not ended. Martha used the quiet to fetch more firewood from the small stack inside the entryway. Each piece felt precious now. If the storm returned or if help failed to come, these logs might be all that kept them alive. As darkness crept back across the prairie, her thoughts turned to the people who must be searching for this child. Somewhere beyond the endless white, a mother's heart must be breaking. Martha imagined a woman pacing inside a tipi, scanning the storm with desperate eyes, wondering if her baby still breathed. The image brought a sharp ache to her chest. She whispered a silent promise to the unseen mother: "Your child is alive, and I will keep him safe." Night fell with a brittle cold. Stars appeared faintly through the thinning clouds. Martha prepared a simple meal of cornmeal mush and dried venison, eating in small bites while keeping the baby close. The silence inside the cabin grew heavy, broken only by the occasional pop of the stove and the soft sigh of the sleeping child. Each sound outside, a shifting drift, a cracking branch, set her nerves on edge. She imagined distant hoofbeats muffled by snow, the quiet approach of riders whose intentions she could not guess. Before bedding down, she wrapped the baby in an extra quilt and laid him in a small wooden box lined with wool, the closest thing she had to a cradle. She placed the box near her own bed, close enough to reach him at once if he stirred. Then she knelt by the stove and prayed, her whispered words rising into the dark. She prayed for the baby's safety, for the mother who must be searching, for the warriors who might already be on their way, and for the courage to face whatever waited beyond the horizon. Through the long hours that followed, Martha drifted in and out of restless sleep. Dreams of snow and shadow blurred with half-heard sounds: the distant cry of coyotes, the groan of settling timbers, the faint echo of horses somewhere in the night. Each time she woke, she reached for the baby to be sure he was warm. Each time she felt the soft rise and fall of his breathing, relief washed through her like a tide. By the second morning, the sky had lightened to a pale, icy blue. The wind had quieted, leaving an eerie stillness over the prairie. The world outside lay blank and shining, a landscape of unbroken white. Martha opened the door a crack and inhaled the sharp, clean air. The snow stretched to the horizon, sparkling under the early sun. No tracks marred its surface. No riders approached. Yet the silence carried its own kind of warning. Somewhere out there, she knew, people were searching. The storm had hidden their movements, but it could not hold them back forever. The second day after the storm began with a cold that felt even sharper than before, though the sky was a clear, blinding blue. Sunlight glittered on the endless fields of snow, turning every drift into a sheet of diamonds. Martha pushed open the door with effort, the packed snow resisting her weight, and stepped outside to breathe the brittle morning air. The storm had passed, but the world remained locked in silence. No tracks disturbed the frozen crust. The horizon stretched white and empty, as if the earth itself had been scrubbed clean. She scanned the distance for any sign of movement, dark shapes, a flicker of smoke, a trail of horses, but there was nothing. Only the cold, the bright sky, and the quiet weight of waiting. Behind her, the baby stirred and whimpered. She turned quickly, heart tugged by the small sound, and re-entered the cabin. The warmth inside wrapped around her like a blanket. The little boy lay in his makeshift cradle, his dark eyes wide and alert. He had survived another night, and his breathing was stronger now, less fragile. Martha lifted him carefully and felt the warmth of his body through the quilt. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of her shawl, grasping with surprising strength. She smiled in spite of the worry pressing at her mind. Each day he lived was a victory, but each day also brought the certainty that someone somewhere was searching for him. She prepared a small meal, moving quietly so as not to wake him fully. While the cornmeal cooked, she thought of the people beyond the horizon. The Comanche camp was days away on horseback, but she knew they could travel swiftly even in winter. Warriors could appear with little warning. Would they see her as a savior or a thief? Would they listen to her story, or would they take the child without a word? These questions circled endlessly in her thoughts, wearing grooves of fear she could not smooth away. After breakfast, she bundled the baby and set about clearing the doorway. The snow had drifted high during the storm, sealing them in like a cave. She worked with a shovel and a short spade, pushing the heavy crust aside in slow, deliberate strokes. Each scrape of metal against ice echoed through the still air. The baby watched from his cradle, eyes following her movements. Sometimes he cooed softly, a sound that carried an odd comfort. Martha paused to smile at him, amazed that such a small life could bring warmth to a frozen world. By midday, thin trails of smoke began to rise on the horizon. At first she thought her eyes were playing tricks, the sun reflecting off distant hills. But the columns remained faint but steady, curling upward into the blue. Her stomach tightened. She shaded her eyes with a gloved hand and watched until she was sure. Somewhere beyond the frozen creek, fires burned. Someone was coming. Fear pressed against her ribs, but with it came a strange calm. The child's family was alive. The storm had not taken them all. The smoke meant people, and people meant answers. She carried the baby to the window and pointed toward the faint haze. "They're out there," she whispered, though he could not understand. "Your people are coming." His small eyes blinked against the light, and he made a soft sound that might have been a sigh. Martha felt a sudden rush of protectiveness. Whatever happened when those riders arrived, she would keep him safe until her last breath. The rest of the day passed in slow anticipation. She gathered firewood, boiled water, and prepared more food than usual, as if readying for guests she could not name. Each task steadied her nerves for a few moments, only for fear to creep back when she stopped moving. As dusk approached, the sky turned a deep violet and the first stars glimmered above the endless white. The smoke on the horizon had thickened. There was no doubt now. A large group was camped not far away. That night's sleep came in restless fragments. The baby slept soundly, but every creak of the cabin walls sent Martha bolt upright. Once she thought she heard distant hoofbeats, faint as a heartbeat under snow. Another time she imagined the soft call of a flute drifting on the wind. She sat by the stove, rocking the child and staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Hours passed with only the whisper of the fire for company. When morning came, the sky was streaked with pink and gold. The smoke columns were closer, darker, and more numerous. Martha stepped outside, the baby held close against her chest. The air carried a faint scent of wood smoke mixed with the clean bite of snow. Somewhere beyond the low hills, 100 campfires burned. The Comanche were on the move. She felt the tremor of possibility in the frozen ground, as if the earth itself sensed the approach of many horses. She spent the morning preparing for their arrival, though she had no plan beyond simple readiness. She laid more logs beside the stove, melted snow for water, and wrapped the baby in fresh cloth. She dressed herself in her warmest clothes, choosing a dark wool dress and the heavy shawl her mother had given her before she left Missouri. The familiar fabric brought a small measure of comfort. She thought of her husband miles away with the supply wagon and wished desperately for his steady presence. But the decision to act, to protect, was hers alone. By afternoon, a new sound reached her ears, a low, rhythmic thunder that grew steadily louder. She froze, heart racing. It was not the wind. It was the sound of hooves, many of them moving in unison. The baby stirred as if sensing the change. Martha clutched him tighter and stepped to the window. At first she saw nothing but the endless sweep of snow. Then, along the far ridge, dark shapes emerged one by one until the entire line of riders came into view. They moved with swift precision, their horses kicking up small clouds of powder as they advanced. Even at a distance, she could see the glint of sunlight on polished weapons, the flash of bright blankets and feathered headdresses. The sight stole her breath. There were dozens of them, perhaps 100. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she hide? Should she step outside before they reached the cabin? Every option carried risk. The Comanche were known for their speed and their pride. Any sign of fear might be read as guilt. Any show of defiance might invite violence. She looked down at the baby in her arms. His dark eyes met hers, calm and trusting. In that gaze she found her answer. She would face them openly. Whatever judgment awaited, she would meet it with the truth. The thunder of hooves grew louder until it filled the air like a storm. Snow vibrated beneath her feet. Shadows passed across the window as the first riders reached the clearing. Martha took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the child, and moved toward the door. The latch felt cold against her fingers. For a moment she thought of the night she had first heard his cry in the blizzard, the lantern flickering in the wind, the desperate rush to save him. That single act had brought her to this moment. With a steadying breath, she lifted the bar and pulled the door open. Outside, the clearing was alive with motion. Horses snorted clouds of steam as warriors reined them to a halt. Bright blankets rippled in the winter wind, and the smell of leather and wood smoke mixed with the sharp scent of snow. Faces turned toward her, stern, unreadable, eyes dark as midnight. At the center of the group sat a tall man wrapped in a fur-lined robe, his posture commanding yet still. His gaze locked on the bundle in her arms. The sudden silence was complete, broken only by the soft whimper of the baby and the restless shifting of horses. Martha stepped forward. The child pressed close to her chest and met the eyes of the man who must be the leader. The clearing lay silent except for the restless snorts of the horses. Steam curled from their flared nostrils and mingled with the faint smoke of many campfires that lingered on the riders' clothes. The sun hung low, a pale disk behind thin winter clouds, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Martha stood at the doorway with the baby in her arms, the rough wood of the doorframe biting cold against her shoulder. Every eye was on her. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, steady and sharp, as though the wind itself had frozen mid-gust to witness the moment. The child shifted slightly beneath the quilt, a soft whimper escaping his lips. That tiny sound, fragile and human, broke the heavy stillness like a pebble dropped into deep water. The leader dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a buffalo robe lined with fur. Beaded bands encircled his arms and a single eagle feather rested against the dark braids of his hair. His eyes, black as river stones, held a calm that was more unnerving than anger. He gave a short command in a language Martha could not understand, and the riders behind him pulled their horses back a few steps, forming a loose circle around the cabin. The movement was precise, almost ceremonial. Snow crunched under hooves, and the faint creak of leather saddles echoed like distant drums. Martha's heart pounded so loudly she feared the warriors could hear it. The leader stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the crust of snow. He stopped a few paces away and studied her without a word. Martha tightened her hold on the baby until she felt the soft weight press against her chest. The child stirred and opened dark eyes that mirrored the eyes of the man before her. A flicker of recognition passed across the leader's face, barely perceptible but unmistakable. He took another step, then another, his gaze never leaving the small bundle. Martha swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to retreat. Instead, she shifted the blanket so the baby's face was visible. Warm breath rose from his tiny mouth in delicate clouds. A murmur swept through the circle of riders. Some leaned forward in their saddles, others lifted their chins in silent acknowledgement. The leader paused and spoke a few quiet words over his shoulder. One of the younger warriors dismounted and approached with cautious steps, his hands held open to show he carried no weapon. He was little more than a boy, his eyes wide with both relief and awe. Martha could feel the tension in the air change, the sharp edge of danger softening into something deeper, anticipation, perhaps, or gratitude held carefully in check. The young warrior stopped a few feet away and placed a hand over his chest. He spoke softly in Comanche, his voice carrying the musical cadence of prayer. Though Martha could not understand the words, the meaning was clear. He bowed his head toward the child, then toward her. The leader followed with a slow nod, his own eyes warming with quiet respect. For a long moment no one moved. The only sounds were the gentle snorting of horses and the faint crackle of the stove behind her. Martha felt the tight knot of fear ease, replaced by a strange calm that settled over her like falling snow. At last the leader spoke in halting English, each word measured and careful. "My son," he said, touching his chest and then pointing to the baby. "You found him." The deep timbre of his voice carried both authority and gratitude. Martha's throat tightened. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard him crying in the storm. I brought him inside. He was so cold." She lowered her gaze to the child and then back to the man. "He is safe." The leader studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing the truth behind her words. Then he placed a hand over his heart and inclined his head in a slow, deliberate gesture of thanks. The circle of warriors stirred. Some dismounted and stepped forward, their movements careful, respectful. They carried small bundles wrapped in deerskin, decorated with beads that shimmered against the white snow. One by one they laid these gifts at the threshold of her cabin: woven blankets, carved figures, pouches of herbs, strips of smoked meat. Each man bowed his head slightly as he placed his offering, their eyes meeting hers with silent acknowledgement. Martha felt tears sting her eyes at the quiet dignity of their actions. These were not the fierce raiders whispered about in frontier towns. These were fathers, brothers, and sons honoring the woman who had saved their blood. The leader extended his arms, palms upward, a silent request. Martha looked down at the baby. The child blinked, unfazed by the gathering of warriors, his small hand clutching the edge of the quilt. Her heart tightened. In the brief days since the storm, she had grown used to his tiny breaths, the way he nestled against her shoulder, the fragile warmth that filled the lonely cabin. Part of her ached at the thought of letting him go. But she knew this moment was not about her. With steady hands, she stepped forward and placed the baby into his father's waiting arms. The leader held his son close, lowering his face to the child's dark hair. He murmured words that sounded like a blessing, the deep music of his language wrapping around them like a protective chant. The baby gave a soft sigh and rested against his father's chest, safe in the embrace of his own blood. Around them the warriors stood in respectful silence, their breath rising in clouds that shimmered in the fading light. After a time the leader looked up, his eyes meeting Martha's once more. "You saved my son," he said slowly. "You are brave woman, you have strong heart." The words carried the weight of something larger than simple gratitude. He gestured to the gifts at her feet. "These for you, from my people." Martha felt her throat tighten again. "I only did what anyone would do," she said, though she knew not everyone would have stepped into the storm that night. The leader tilted his head slightly, as if to say he understood more than her words could express. The young warrior who had first approached stepped forward again. From a pouch at his side, he drew a small necklace made of polished bone and turquoise beads. He placed it gently into Martha's hand, his dark eyes shining. "To remember," he said softly. The simple phrase carried a warmth that cut through the winter chill. Martha closed her fingers around the necklace, feeling the smooth beads against her skin. She nodded in silent thanks, unable to find words. The warriors began to mount their horses, their movements swift but unhurried. The leader cradled his son with one arm while swinging easily into the saddle. He turned once more to Martha, raising a hand in a gesture of respect. The other riders echoed the motion, a ripple of raised hands that moved through the circle like a wave. The sound of leather and hooves filled the clearing as they prepared to depart. The leader spoke a final word, something soft and melodic that Martha could not understand, but felt in her chest like the echo of distant thunder. As the column of riders began to move, the ground trembled under the rhythm of 100 hooves. Snow swirled in their wake, sparkling in the late afternoon light. Martha stood in the doorway clutching the necklace, watching as the warriors wound their way across the white prairie. The baby's small face peeked from the folds of his father's robe, dark eyes glancing back once, as if to imprint the memory of the woman who had carried him through the storm. The sound of hooves faded into the open sky, leaving only the hush of winter and the faint scent of smoke. The clearing grew still again. The gifts lay at her feet, bright against the snow, proof of a connection forged in a night of danger and a morning of quiet gratitude. Martha drew a slow breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. Her heart still beat fast, but the fear that had haunted her since the storm had melted away, replaced by a deep, steady warmth. The prairie stretched endless and silent once more, yet it no longer felt empty. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a family rode home with their child, and the bond created in the heart of a blizzard would remain, unseen but enduring, across the vast white land. Night returned to the prairie with a quiet that felt almost unreal after the thunder of so many hooves. Martha lingered at the doorway long after the last shadow of a rider vanished beyond the hills. The gifts still rested where the warriors had laid them, their bright colors glowing faintly under the pale light of a rising moon. She knelt to gather them one by one, her fingers brushing beads, smooth leather, and finely woven cloth. Each item carried the warmth of the hands that had placed it there, a silent promise that the encounter had been more than a passing exchange. The cold bit at her cheeks, but a strange calm settled over her heart. The storm had brought danger, but it had also carried a moment of connection that felt larger than the endless stretch of land around her. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, filling the small room with the scent of wood smoke and the soft crackle of embers. Martha spread the gifts on the table. There were blankets dyed in deep reds and blues, a pouch of fragrant herbs that released a sweet, earthy scent, strips of smoked meat wrapped in deerskin, and a carved wooden figure of a mother holding a child. She ran her hand over the smooth curves of the carving, the details so fine she could feel the shape of tiny fingers against the mother's chest. It was more than a token of thanks. It was a symbol of trust, a bridge between two worlds that had once feared each other. She sat for a long time staring at the necklace the young warrior had given her. The polished bone beads gleamed softly in the firelight, each one threaded with turquoise that caught the faint flicker of flame. When he placed it in her hand, he had spoken only 2 words: to remember. The simplicity of the gift held a weight she could not fully name. She thought of the baby's dark eyes and the way he had curled against her shoulder during the storm. She thought of the leader's quiet gaze as he held his son for the first time. They had spoken few words, yet an entire story of fear, courage, and gratitude had passed between them. Exhaustion eventually settled over her like a heavy quilt. She banked the fire, drew the blankets close, and lay down on her bed. But sleep came only in restless waves. Her mind replayed the day in vivid fragments, the sound of approaching hooves, the sudden silence when the warriors surrounded the cabin, the feel of the baby's warmth as she handed him to his father. Each memory glowed sharp and bright, etched into her heart like a series of small, unbreakable truths. She had stepped into the storm to save a life, not knowing who the child belonged to or what danger might follow. Now she understood that the storm had not only brought a test of courage, but a chance to see the humanity that lived beyond the lines settlers so often drew in fear. When morning broke, the prairie lay quiet beneath a thin veil of mist. The sun rose slowly, painting the snow in soft pink and gold. Martha dressed in silence, the necklace resting against her collarbone like a gentle weight. She brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, sipping the bitter warmth while the world outside stirred awake. The tracks of the warriors were still visible, a winding path of compressed snow that disappeared over the distant ridge. She traced the trail with her eyes, imagining them riding across the plains with the rescued child at the center of their formation, wrapped safely in blankets, his father's arm shielding him from the cold. As the day stretched on, Martha found herself moving through the cabin with a quiet energy. She stacked firewood, swept the floor, and sorted the remaining supplies, but every task carried a new sense of purpose. The cabin no longer felt like a lonely outpost clinging to the edge of survival. It felt like a place where two worlds had met, and for a brief moment, recognized each other's worth. Each creak of the timbers, each spark from the stove, reminded her of the night she had stepped outside to follow a distant cry and discovered that compassion could bridge the deepest divides. Neighbors arrived 2 days later, their sleds creaking over the packed snow. Word of the storm had reached the settlement, and they came to check on her welfare. Their eyes widened at the sight of the gifts displayed across her table. Questions poured forth in quick succession. Had she really faced 100 warriors alone? Were the rumors of a lost Comanche child true? Martha answered calmly, her voice steady as she recounted the night of the blizzard and the arrival of the riders. Some listeners shook their heads in disbelief. Others sat in thoughtful silence, their expressions softening as they absorbed the details of gratitude and honor. A few looked uneasy, as though her story challenged the hardened fears they carried about the people who shared this land. One neighbor, a gray-haired farmer named Boone, finally spoke. "You could have turned that baby away," he said slowly. "Most folks would have been too scared to bring him inside. Might have saved their own skin and let him freeze." His eyes met hers with something like respect. "But you didn't." Martha felt a quiet strength rise within her. "It wasn't about fear," she said. "It was about life. He was a child. That's all I needed to know." The visitors lingered for hours, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the power of the story. Some offered to stay the night, but Martha declined with a gentle smile. She appreciated their concern, yet she sensed that what had happened was something she needed to hold close, unclouded by gossip or speculation. When they finally departed, their sleds cutting fresh tracks across the white fields, the cabin returned to its familiar stillness. Yet it was not the same silence as before. It carried a new kind of peace, rich and full, like the hush that follows a hymn. Days turned into weeks, and the signs of spring began to creep across the prairie. Snow softened and melted into dark patches of earth. Thin streams of water trickled through the low places, carrying the first scents of mud and new grass. Martha kept the necklace close, wearing it each morning as she stepped outside to greet the changing world. Each time she felt the smooth beads against her skin, she remembered the quiet nod of the Comanche leader, the weight of his son in her arms, and the sound of 100 riders fading into the horizon. Sometimes, when the evening sky burned with the deep reds of sunset, she imagined the child growing strong among his people. She pictured him running across open grasslands, laughing beneath the endless blue of summer, safe in the circle of his family. Perhaps one day he would hear the story of the winter storm and the woman who carried him from the snow. Perhaps he would remember nothing of the night he almost died, yet carry within him the quiet bond forged by an act of simple human care. Martha's husband returned at last with the supply wagon, his face drawn tight with worry when he first glimpsed the cabin. She met him at the door and told him everything: the blizzard, the baby, the warriors, the gifts. He listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from her face to the necklace, then to the carved figure on the table. When she finished, he exhaled slowly and pulled her into a long embrace. "You did what was right," he said softly. And because of that, we have friends where others have only fear. As the prairie shifted toward spring, Martha carried the memory of the storm like a quiet flame. The days grew longer, the nights less bitter, but the lessons of that frozen night stayed sharp and clear. She understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She knew that compassion could travel across languages, across histories of conflict, across every invisible wall that men built between one another. And she knew that somewhere out on the vast plains, a child lived because a woman stepped into the dark and listened to a cry carried by the wind. Spring arrived on the prairie like a slow breath after a long-held silence. The frozen rivers loosened their grip, water murmuring beneath sheets of melting ice. Grass began to push through the damp earth in thin green shoots, and the air carried the clean scent of thawing soil. Each morning, Martha stepped outside her cabin to watch the change. The world that had been locked in white now softened to brown and gold, then to the first bright signs of new life. The necklace of bone and turquoise rested against her collar each day, warm from her skin, a quiet reminder of the night that had altered the rhythm of her days. She moved through her chores with a steadiness she had not felt before. Splitting wood, tending the stove, mending clothes, all of it carried a weight that went beyond survival. Each task linked her to a memory of the storm, the baby's cry, and the riders who had filled the clearing with their silent respect. When the wind swept across the plains, she sometimes thought she heard echoes of that moment. The muffled thunder of 100 horses, the soft murmur of a language she did not speak but somehow understood. These sounds lived inside her now, shaping the quiet spaces of her mind. Neighbors came more often as the weather improved. They brought seeds for planting, letters from distant relatives, and the restless energy that followed a hard winter. Around her table they spoke of cattle prices and spring floods, but sooner or later the talk always turned to the night of the warriors. Each visitor wanted to hear the story again, to picture the circle of riders and the gifts laid in the snow. Martha told it simply, without drama, her voice calm but firm. She described the baby's cold little hands, the leader's steady gaze, the way fear had dissolved into a shared understanding. Some listeners leaned in with wide eyes, thrilled by the danger. Others sat back, their expressions softening as they absorbed the quiet power of the encounter. One evening, a preacher from the settlement stopped by on his way to another homestead. He listened in silence as Martha recounted the storm and the unexpected guests. When she finished, he set his hat on the table and folded his hands. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes he sends strangers to test the boundaries of our hearts." Martha nodded politely but said nothing. She did not need anyone to explain what she had felt. The lesson had already written itself deep within her, beyond the reach of sermons or scripture. As the prairie softened, she began walking farther from the cabin, following the faint tracks left by the departing warriors. The snow had melted, but the memory of their path remained etched in the earth, a subtle line of compressed soil and trampled grass. She followed it across low hills and shallow creeks until the trail disappeared into open country. Standing alone beneath the vast sky, she imagined the riders carrying the rescued child back to their camp. She wondered if the baby remembered the warmth of her arms or the sound of her voice humming through the storm. Perhaps he carried no memory at all, only the deep, unspoken comfort of having been held when life hung by a thread. Sometimes, when the evening sun burned orange over the horizon, Martha built a small fire outside and sat beside it with the necklace in her hand. She would trace each bead with her fingers, feeling the smooth bone and cool turquoise while the prairie darkened around her. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising in lonely chorus. She thought of the Comanche leader lifting his son into the saddle, of the gifts laid carefully at her door, of the young warrior who had said to remember. These nights were not filled with sadness but with a strange, quiet gratitude. The storm had brought fear and danger, yet it had also given her a glimpse of something rare. the raw humanity that lives beneath the surface of all people, no matter how far apart their worlds might seem. Her husband finally returned from his long trip to the trading post. When she told him everything, he listened without interruption, his weathered face shifting from concern to awe. He examined each gift, lifting the blankets to feel the weight of the beads and tracing the carved figure of the mother and child with careful fingers. When she finished, he placed his hand over hers and said softly, "What you did will be told for years. Not because of the danger, but because you chose mercy over fear." His words settled in the room like a blessing, but Martha knew the story's power did not belong to her alone. It belonged to everyone who would hear it and feel the quiet possibility of kindness stronger than any storm. The weeks passed, and the prairie changed from brown to green. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, their colors bright against the soft grass. Birds returned in great flocks, filling the mornings with song. Martha worked in her small garden, planting seeds brought by neighbors and watching the first sprouts break through the soil. The land that had nearly taken her life now offered new growth, as if the earth itself wanted to mark the passing of danger with abundance. Each time she bent to tend the young plants, she thought of the child she had saved and the life he would now have among his people. Sometimes she imagined a future day when he might ride across these fields as a grown man, strong and sure. Perhaps he would stop at this very cabin, drawn by a memory too deep to name. Perhaps he would stand in the doorway as his father once had, eyes searching for the woman who had carried him from the storm. She did not know if such a meeting would ever come, but the thought filled her with a quiet hope that reached far beyond her own lifetime. The settlers who heard her story began to treat the nearby Comanche camp with a new caution, and in some cases, a new respect. Fences that once divided neighbors softened into paths of cautious exchange. Hunters returned from the prairie with reports of friendly gestures, shared water at a creek, a silent nod across a field. Martha never claimed credit for these small changes, but she sensed that the night of the storm had rippled outward, carrying with it a lesson that others felt even if they could not name it. Compassion, once offered, does not stay contained. It moves through communities like spring water through dry soil, leaving traces of life wherever it goes. On the warmest evenings, Martha sat on the porch and watched the stars appear one by one in the vast Texas sky. She remembered the baby's tiny heartbeat against her chest, the steady eyes of the warrior leader, and the thunder of horses fading into the distance. The memory was no longer a sharp blade of fear, but a deep well of calm. She had faced a night when life and death balanced on the edge of a single choice. She had stepped into the storm and found, waiting inside the cold and darkness, not only a child but a bridge between worlds. The necklace around her neck glowed faintly in the starlight, each bead a silent promise that the bond forged in that blizzard would remain, carried on the wind across the endless plains, as enduring as the land itself.